All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Meg Olson, and I am the Grassroots Mobilization Manager at Network Lobby. I'm also a member of the Faithful Democracy Coalition. Thank you for joining the Faithful Democracy Coalition for our town hall today on protecting our elections in the face of COVID-19. The Faithful Democracy Coalition is a multi-faith coalition of faith-based organizations, houses of worship, and congregations working together for a just and representative democracy. In 2019, we created Unheard Voices, a year-long series of toolkits and webinars to educate people of faith on ways that we can ensure that everyone has access to our democracy through fair representation and the right to cast their vote. However, like everyone right now, we are changing our course to ensure that our elections are safe and fair during this challenging time. So we're glad that you can join us on the first of these efforts. And a special hello to everyone who's joining us on Facebook Live. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Faithful Democracy Coalition for putting together such a great agenda for today. I'd also like to thank Reverend Tracy Blackman, Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, Sister Quincy Howard, and Reverend Jimmy Hawkins for joining us to share their wisdom and their spirit. You'll see, looking at our agenda, that after Sister Quincy talks about the congressional state of play, we'll have a few minutes for questions. Throughout this town hall, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll be monitoring those. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can also just type your questions into the comments section. I also just want to let you know, in case we don't get to your question, we are tracking all of them, and we'll get back to you over email. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Reverend Tracy Blackman. Tracy is the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. She is also the Senior Pastor of Christ the King UCC in Florissant, Missouri. As a featured voice on many regional, national, and international platforms, Reverend Blackman's life work focuses on faith-filled communal resistance to systemic injustice. I first met Tracy during our work together in St. Louis in the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown. And she's definitely inspired me by her call to action to always pray with our feet. Thank you so much, Reverend Tracy Blackman.
Thank you so much, Meg, for this invitation, and thank you to Faithful Democracy for the work you're doing in this moment, but also the work that you have been doing for a while and will continue to do in the future. If it's okay, I'd like to begin with a prayer by an author who remains unknown, but has touched me much in this moment. Let us pray. Grant us, God, a vision of your world as your love would have it. A world where the weak are protected and none go hungry or poor. A world where the riches of creation are shared and everyone can enjoy them. A world where different races and cultures live in harmony and mutual respect. A world where peace is built with justice and justice is guided by love. A world that respects the divinity and the value and the worth of all of creation. Give us the inspiration and the courage to build it. In the many names that we call, Amen. In the 2013 decision of Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court invalidated a decade-old pre-clearance order, if you will, that named jurisdictions that had historical trouble with voting rights to pass federal scrutiny under the Voting Rights Act in order to pass any new elections or voting laws. Those jurisdictions were selected based on these areas having a history of discrimination in voting. Following that decision, states were free to once again adopt voting laws that have an adverse impact on minority voters, including laws that eliminate polling places in the manner we recently witnessed in Wisconsin, move them to less accessible locations as we witnessed in Georgia and many other southern states, or reduce the hours that they are open to make it more difficult for many lower wage working people to exercise their constitutional right to vote. These laws also allow states to tighten voter ID requirements and reduce early voting and Sunday voting, which is popular in many of our regions in the South. The intent of such laws is clear. The result of these actions have been intentional and predictable. Voter identification laws have made it more difficult for poor people, elderly Black people, many of whom have strong voting records but lack birth certificates because of the historical racialized hatred of this country, and Latinx people who exercise their constitutional right to vote free from harassment. Such abuses of power now happen without congressional intervention or oversight. Since 2018, 23 states have enacted laws that make it more difficult for everyone to participate in our democracy. Our vote is our opportunity to have our voices heard beyond coffee tables, beyond pulpits, and beyond proclamations and demonstrations in the public square. Our vote is the means by which our voices permeate the soundproof walls of local and federal government to ensure visibility of all of our citizens. Author, political activist, and theologian Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, in his book, The Politics of Jesus, presents to us a portrait of Jesus, the political revolutionary who dedicated his earthly ministry to treating the people's needs as holy. Jesus used those 3 years of public engagement to expose empty religious rhetoric and to center the needs of those who were made vulnerable by a greedy and oppressive society. For Christians, which is the faith that I adhere to, what this means is to be faithful. One must be intricately tied to the earthly mission of Jesus to treat the needs of people and the needs of creation as holy. And though I find this to be true in Christianity, I also find it to be true in the multiple faiths that we all share. We share a connection in that we all are compelled to treat the people's needs as holy. Just as Jesus exposed the hypocrisy of those who cry out to God but fail to act on God's behalf, we are currently in the midst of another such unveiling. COVID-19 has laid bare for us the social inequities of our society. We are watching as people who have less resources, people who have less access to cash, people who are caused to live on top of one another because real estate is not accessible to them, people who are doing essential work but have been undervalued workers, people who are standing in long lines going around blocks just to get food in a country that has more than enough. Beyond the deaths of COVID-19, we have laid bare the inequities of our society. And voting is more important than ever. To be a voice that says we are not people who want to live this way. To be a voice that says partisanship is not more important to us than principle. To be a voice that says everyone deserves health care. Everyone deserves a living wage. Everyone deserves to know that they can make it through being valued as much as everyone else in times such as these. My friends, voting is always important, but in upcoming elections, on the local level and on the federal level, we must make our voices heard and felt. And so I salute this coalition who is dedicated to making sure that everyone's voice matters in a time when our country needs to hear what really matters most. We're spending a lot of time talking about opening up businesses, opening up schools. We need to be spending our time talking about opening up polling booths, opening up the opportunity for the voices that are often unheard to be heard. Thank you.
Amen, amen, Reverend Tracy. Thank you. I am now thrilled to introduce Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, who's joining us from Madison, Wisconsin. Bonnie is the founder and executive director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. She is also the chair of the Wisconsin Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, as well as a member of the board of the NAACP of Dane County, and a founder and steering committee member for the Dane County Sanctuary Coalition. Bonnie, we are so glad that you could join us today. Can you tell us what happened in Wisconsin?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this town hall and to share the amazing story of what happened in Wisconsin and what's still going on in Wisconsin. So our election on April 7th was a morass, and all of the things that went on behind the scenes the weeks before the election, very long and complicated. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So the Thursday before the election, a federal court judge said that our absentee ballots did not need witness signatures. So people were sending in their absentee ballots without signatures because they were safer at home, which is what our stay-at-home order is called, and didn't have any way to get their ballots witnessed. And so 24 hours later, that decision by the federal court was overturned by an appellate court, and so all of those ballots were invalidated. At least 750 ballots in Milwaukee alone were invalidated for lack of signature. In Dane County, which is where Madison is, our county clerk said that if you requested an absentee ballot online and they asked for an ID and you couldn't upload an ID, you could say you were indefinitely confined, because essentially we are all indefinitely confined under Safer at Home. And therefore you don't need an ID. That also was declared to be illegal, so people who didn't submit an ID couldn't get an absentee ballot. Some of the nonprofits around the state were calling for the election to be postponed, and our governor's position was that it was too difficult, too costly, and would leave some of our local elections with those seats unfilled for too long of a time. Some of our municipalities asked for the election to be postponed because they didn't have enough workers to open the polls. Other municipalities said we can't postpone the election because we can't afford what that would mean in terms of the cost. Finally, on April 6th, the day before our election, that morning our governor signed an executive order to postpone the election to June 9th. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court just a few hours later overturned that decision. At the same time, a federal court judge had said that absentee ballots could be postmarked as late as April 13th. And on April 6th, again, the day before the election, the United States Supreme Court overturned that and said, no, ballots have to be postmarked by April 7th, by the day of the election. So I was a poll worker, and we were getting emails on April 6th all day long saying, don't listen to the news, we don't know what's happening, everything is being litigated, plan on coming to work tomorrow. So, you know, and then outlining all the different ways that we were going to be protected and that people coming to vote were going to be protected. So they were going to have plexiglass screens placed on all of the tables to be a barrier between the voter and the poll workers. The poll workers were supposed to be seated at the tables 6 feet apart. Everybody coming into the polling place was supposed to stand 6 feet apart. We have curbside voting, Usually it's for elderly and handicapped, but it was opened up to anybody for any reason or no reason at all. And we were told that if we went out as poll workers to people's cars, we were going to have plexiglass face shields. So I got to our polling place at 6 o'clock that morning. And the polling places had been severely restricted. So we had about 7,000 poll workers across the state who said that they could not come to work because they were afraid of catching the virus. Many poll workers, as you know, tend to be older people, tend to be retired, tend to be people who are in the high risk category. So very understandably, a lot of them just were not comfortable working the polls that day. So there was a severe shortage of poll workers. In Madison or in Dane County, the number of polling places was reduced from 95 to 63. In Waukesha, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, the polling places were reduced from 13 down to 1. But the most egregious was Milwaukee, which usually has 180 polling places, and it was reduced to 5. And this was clearly a blatant attempt to suppress the minority vote because Milwaukee has the greatest percentage of minority population as anywhere else in the state. So there were not enough poll workers. The National Guard was called out and helped to fill the gaps with some of the poll workers. In Milwaukee, again, it was the most egregious. There were people standing in line for more than 2 hours in the rain, in the cold, people at risk who were at risk for the virus, but are also standing out in the rain and in the cold for hours waiting to vote. There was a lack of PPE. There was a total lack of social distancing. Some of the locations around Wisconsin moved their polling places into gymnasiums so that they could keep 6 feet apart from each other while standing in line waiting to vote. My polling place was a small shelter in one of our local parks. There was no pretense of social distancing. It was ridiculous. There was no room for social distancing. We did have the plexiglass barriers on the tables, but as we were setting up at 6 o'clock that morning and setting up the tables and the chairs, and I said, aren't the chairs supposed to be 6 feet apart? And they all just looked at me like I was out of my mind because there was no place for the chairs to be 6 feet apart. We had so many people coming in who were dropping off their absentee ballots because they hadn't gotten them early enough to be able to mail them in to be guaranteed they would be postmarked April 7th. They had to bring them in person in order to be sure that they would be counted. And many people who came in and said, I ordered my absentee ballot a week ago or even 2 weeks ago, and it still hasn't shown up, so I have to come in to vote or else I won't be able to vote at all. Our state election commission received almost 1.3 million requests for absentee ballots, and over 1 million were returned. So it took from April 7th to April 13th to count all the absentee ballots. And then they found that there were 3 barrels of absentee ballots in one of the post offices that had just never been delivered. So it was a crazy day. That was the culmination of 2 crazy weeks of, is the election on? Is it off? What can I do with my absentee ballot? Do I need a witness? Don't I need a witness? Do I need ID? Don't I need ID? And every day it was a different court order and then being overturned and being litigated. And our Republican leadership went to our state Supreme Court after the governor's decision to postpone and sued in our Supreme Court to have that overturned, and it was overturned. It was a crazy experience, and trying to keep people informed of what was happening. And the day before, on April 6th, I literally was every hour sending out another set of e-newsletters and emails and updates on Facebook saying, this is what the current state is. And then an hour later, no, sorry, that's not true anymore. This is what the current state is. And so people were terribly confused and not knowing whether their ballots were going to count or not. We have seen, as of yesterday, there were 52 confirmed cases of COVID that are potentially linked to the election. It's hard to say for sure because most of those people also reported other exposures, such as, I went to the grocery store or whatever, but there has been that uptick in cases that seem to be traceable to the election and to people having to go out to vote. So it's been craziness, and right now, even as we speak, our Republican leadership is at the Wisconsin State Supreme Court trying to overturn the governor's safer at home order. Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice just filed an amicus brief this morning with letters from 29 clergy saying, don't do that. We want our people to stay safe. And, we're doing all we can to keep in touch with our congregations and do pastoral counseling and provide worship services and do all the usual things that we do, but do them online to keep everybody safe. And it's not time to open up the state and go back to work.
Oh, thank you so much, Rabbi Connie. That just sounds like such a nightmare. And thank you for all of your persistence and for all of the clergy and people in Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice for persevering and making sure that the elections could happen.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Sister Quincy Howard. Sister Quincy is a specialist in the network's government relations team, where she leads up our democracy work. She also co-chairs the Faithful Democracy Coalition. Sister Quincy is a professed Dominican sister of Sinsinawa, and she is passionate about Catholic social justice and the call to action to protect and serve the most vulnerable among us. So Sister Quincy, what is needed from Congress in the fourth COVID-4 legislative package to protect our election and make sure that Wisconsin doesn't happen again?
Thanks so much for the introduction, Meg. I apologize in advance if I sound choppy. It looks like I might be having some Wi-Fi issues. But it is just such an honor to be on this panel with these three powerful faith leaders. And the story in Wisconsin is so disheartening, and to still be hearing the election results, but not in the way that we would like to hear them, and potential cases of COVID-19 resulting from that horrible experience. Exercising the right to vote should not have life or death stakes, and it doesn't need to, even in a pandemic. We know that. We know what's needed to run elections and to keep voters safe while also protecting their voting rights. It requires planning. It requires preparation by states and localities to avoid the kind of confusion and discord and the partisan politics that we saw take over the election in Wisconsin. We don't want to see that moving forward. And really what is needed at this time, the very first step is federal funding. This is what is needed to help states and localities that we know are in fiscal crisis due to the current pandemic. They can't move forward without knowing that there is a steady source of funding coming their way from the federal government. We did actually see in the CARES Act last month, we did see some federal funding. We saw $400 million for state elections, which was the CARES Act was really a bipartisan success story of Congress responding to the pandemic. But also $400 million we know is not even close to what's going to be needed to ensure safe and fair elections in 2020. This means the remaining primaries as well as the general election in November. States and local jurisdictions are estimated to need $4 billion to do the job right and to run their elections, their upcoming elections. $4 billion may seem like a lot of money, However, it puts it in perspective when you think about the fact that that's 2.2% of the total price tag for the last CARES Act. And if you ask me, that seems like a bargain to ensure that we have safe and fair elections. Am I still coming in? I'm getting an unstable sign. Okay, great. So another thing I would like to say about funding is that we want to make sure that the Election Assistance Commission, which is the agency that is responsible to administer these funds to states and local jurisdictions, that they have enough resources to be able to do that quickly and effectively. So we're looking for $4 million for the Election Assistance Commission. And one final thing about the funding is that even that 400 million, this is a lot of fours, I know, it makes it easier to remember, I guess. Even that $400 million in funding that we already saw, that continues to have matching requirements to states. And we know that states are in no position at this time to be able to match grant funds. So we're asking for all matching requirements and election funding to be waived during the coronavirus pandemic. But we also know that funding alone is not going to be enough. It is not the total solution. We also need pro-safety and pro-voter policies to go hand in hand with election protection funding. This means potentially tying some priorities to that funding going to states and localities so they understand the steps that are needed. I'm just going to quickly go over these. One of them, the first one really is to prohibit polling place adjustments that would disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. We know from the history that Reverend Tracy talked about that there is a long and sordid history of voter suppression and intimidation, and we need to first and foremost make sure that these communities are protected. We also need to make sure that there are polling contingency plans for the kinds of situations that Rabbi Bonnie spoke to, that polling places are able to protect the health and the safety of the voters as well as the poll workers that need to be there. We need to expand registration options, which includes online and same-day registration so that people don't need to needlessly put themselves in harm's way in order to register to vote. We also want to expand early voting, and what this does is it allows a longer period of time for people to go in and vote. So it minimizes the types of lines we saw in Wisconsin and the crowding of polling places. And so crucial to this effort of protecting the vote is to have no excuse vote by mail for every voter. This means that people can exercise their right to vote from the safety of their own homes. They don't need to expose themselves if they are fearful. And we can have various options to request and return ballots that would provide people with the best way for them to vote and to cast their ballot. So important is maintaining and expanding opportunities to vote in person. While mail-in ballots are extremely important to allow people to vote, we also cannot get rid of physical locations for polling places. We know that there are people who will not be able to vote by mail, whether that has to do with their living situations or if something goes wrong with their ballots. And they need to have options for physical locations to go to. And the final thing I would say is that we need to fund public education campaign. These are a lot of adjustments that we're talking about making moving forward, and we need voters to be aware of new voting practices and to be able to squash disinformation quickly as soon as it emerges. The final thing that I would say is that this is not a partisan issue. Election officials across the country, regardless of their party, agree on what's needed. But unfortunately, there are still efforts to politicize it, much like we saw in Wisconsin, up to the top levels of our government. The faith community is really a key voice in pushing back against the partisan narrative, which is why Faithful Democracy, a multi-faith coalition, is pushing for Congress, particularly Senate Republicans, who are going to be crucial to get this funding included in the next package. to include it in the next response bill. And we're trying to impress upon them the nonpartisan nature of protecting our elections. Our sign-on letter is a place for faith-based organizations, houses of worship, and congregations to show congressional leaders that there's broad support among people of faith to protect voting rights and public safety in the upcoming elections. And Reverend Jimmy will tell you about that towards the end of the town hall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Quincy, for sharing all of that with us. We have a lot of work ahead of us for Congress. I want to pause now for a few questions, both from folks who are on Zoom and folks watching Facebook Live. So if you haven't already, please type your question into the Q&A box. Jason Miller from Franciscan Action Network has been monitoring that. And then we also have Ness Perry watching on Facebook Live for comments. We are trying to be respectful of everyone's time today. So if we don't answer your question, know that we are tracking them and we will follow up with you over email. So Jason, do we have any questions from the folks on Zoom?
Yes, thank you so much, Meg. I'm just going to take these in order. The first one is from Robert. He wants to know, how can we fight for fair elections when there are forces in power who don't want them to be fair? Example, Trump does not want all mail voting. Another example, Brian Kemp purposely sat on 60,000 voter registrations prior to his gubernatorial election against Stacey Abrams.
Should I take that question? It is a big question and it is a key question. I think we are at a state where people in the United States are really waking up to the modern day, the 21st century version of voter suppression. And what we need to do is use this opportunity. We need to use this pandemic as an opportunity to help people understand how important their vote is. There's a reason that some in power are trying to keep people from voting, and that's a testament to how powerful the voice of the people can be. I think what we do is we continue to consistently push for voting rights. We continue to stay in solidarity around the importance of making sure that votes can happen. And as I said earlier, it is a nonpartisan message, and we have to stick to that and make sure that we don't get caught in that trap.
Thanks, Quincy. Jason, I think we have time for one or two more, please.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. We appreciate all the questions coming in. We'll try to follow up with each of you afterwards if we don't get to them on this town hall. And I will say, before I get to the next one, I see a question about the post office. I'll just mention that I was on a different webinar about that, and that is also an issue. And it's related to voting, obviously, but the post office is going to need additional support. I know the Postal Office Union is calling for $25 billion, which is certainly a lot. But you're often hear from the president that the post office isn't making money. It's because of the law passed in 2006, which required them to pay their pensions 10 years into the future, which is why they're struggling for cash. So that's just a quick answer to that question, but we want to get back to ones more directly related to voting, even though they're all really important. We're seeing a question here where we're asking if we can explain why simply voting by mail wouldn't be a good solution, and doesn't it work in places like Oregon? Anyone like to take that?
I can speak to that one. So there are states, including Colorado and Oregon, that do all vote by mail. It really took them years to ramp up to that level of being able to depend on their system. So having a foolproof infrastructure like that takes time to build. And what we are pushing for is no excuse absentee ballots, which has been part of every state's voting process for years. It is already worked into the infrastructure, We want to expand that capacity so that people don't need to have a reason for requesting an absentee ballot, or their reason could be there's a pandemic. It would be straightforward and it would expand that capacity significantly, but we know that it would not be perfect. And so we need to also have physical locations for polling places for those people who are not able to utilize that system for whatever reason.
I like to give some examples of people who might not be able to utilize that system. In our country, there are people who don't have mailing addresses and they still deserve the right to vote. So a voting system that is only based on mail would disenfranchise people who are unhoused or unsheltered, or who may for other reasons not have a mailing address that they can connect to. And it also robs people of the ability, if they want to, come into a polling booth and experience what that's like in person. There are people, I know people who don't even trust mail-in ballots. I don't think that that's valid, but their perception is reality. And at a time when we should be making voting easy and accessible to everyone, there's no reason to have an either-or system. We should be doing everything we can to make it easy for people to vote in whatever way they decide to vote.
Thanks so much for that, Tracy. I would agree that it's definitely a both and solution, and there is a way to protect our democracy and to keep people safe and healthy at the same time. We just need to have the will in order to do it. And, real quick, see another question is asking, what do we say to those who say that mail-in voting is not secure? Yes, maybe some folks want to do that in person, and that's their right. But for those who are saying that it's not secure, perhaps like the president, you may have seen that, he requested a mail-in ballot from Florida and submitted it back in March.
Thanks, Jason. Ness, are there any questions coming in from our folks watching on Facebook Live?
So as of right now, we have mostly comments. I do not see any questions.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I'm sure that you're wondering what we can do as activists, as voters, as constituents to protect our elections. I am so pleased today that Reverend Jimmy Ray Hawkins has joined us to give us our marching orders. Reverend Jimmy Hawkins serves as the director of the Presbyterian Church USA, Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. Prior to coming to D.C., Reverend Hawkins served for 20 years as the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Durham, North Carolina. And I'm sure we all know about North Carolina's history of voter suppression. So, Reverend Hawkins, tell us what we need to do to protect our elections.
I'm really just so pleased to be here today to talk about this vital issue. And as a person of color, I completely understand how voter suppression is an attack against the rights of people of color, against impoverished men and women throughout the country. And one of the things that we want to talk about in this ask is for all of us to consider voting as a spiritual discipline. It's a means for us to be able to execute justice, especially for the vulnerable throughout the world. It's a means for us to see that those who are in political positions of authority, that they are men and women of integrity who care more about the citizens of this country than they do about their own particular party or own interest. To see it as a means wherein we as people of faith can ensure that this nation fulfills all of the creeds that it has put forth, liberty and justice for all, caring for the least of these, as we read in Holy Scripture. So what can we do to protect our elections? One of the things that you can do readily is to call your senators. Tell them that $4 billion in federal funding is needed in the next COVID response package to support safe and fair elections in the pandemic. To make sure that funding prioritizes pro-voter, pro-safety solutions that equally protect voting rights and public health. We ask that you visit the link that is posted before you for networkadvocates.org at Faithful Democracy, and to do two vital things. One, have your house of worship or faith-based organization sign on to Faithful Democracy COVID letter to protect our 2020 election and to ensure voting rights during the pandemic. We also ask that you sign up to receive updates for the Faithful Democracy Initiative. Please support the work of Faithful Democracy as it continues to monitor what is going on around the country. And as Meg mentioned, I'm from the state of North Carolina, and North Carolina was sued by the NAACP back in 2016. And when the suit was, we lost in the lower court, but when we went before the Fourth Circuit Court in Richmond, Virginia, not only did they overturn the prior ruling against the NAACP, but also said that the state used race and racism with, quote, surgical precision, end quote, to deny the right to vote to African Americans in the state of North Carolina. This is occurring all around the country. And as Reverend Tracy said, there are 23 bills, 23 states which are practicing voter suppression. So please go out and protect the right to vote.
All right. Thank you so much, Reverend Tracy Blackman and Rabbi Bonnie Margulis and Reverend Jimmy Hawkins and Sister Quincy Howard for joining us today. We are going to be sharing this recording on everyone who registered will receive it in an email, and you'll also receive the slides as well as the links for the call to action. This will also be posted on Facebook Live and Network's website, and I'm sure we can share the link to our other organizations so that you can post the recording as well. For those of you who didn't have questions answered, we will follow up with you in email, so thank you for your patience. And I think we feel equipped to go forth and protect our democracy. Thank you so much, and blessings on all of you. Stay healthy, connected, and most importantly, hopeful for our election and our democracy. Thanks.
Amen.
Amen.